and our NGRI colleagues. So, before starting, I would like to welcome our guest speaker for this lecture. So, I would like to invite you with the President of SPG, Dr. Labani Madam, Secretary Dr. Mandalji on the dais. Please have a seat. For a formal welcome, we generally use the flowers in the bouquet from our NGRI garden itself to mention this facility. So I invite Rosemary to give the bouquet to the guest. Ms. Fatima, to the President of SPG, Dr. Lavani Ray. Ms. Grisha, the Secretary of the SPG Hyderabad Chapter, Dr. Biswajit Mandal. Thank you. So before the lecture starts, first I would like to invite Dr. Labani Ray, Madam, who is the President of SPG, to tell something about SPG and its activities. So, please, ma'am.
Very good morning, everybody. Distinguished scientists, professors, SPG members, and my dear students. So, this is the talk for the SPG chapter, but for the behalf of the students, I just make few slides for the SPG. Basically, for the students, all other people may be knowing, and then I will tell what we are doing in the SPG chapter also. So, SPG Society of Petroleum Geophysicists. So SPG India is a premier professional body that has been dedicated for advancing the science and practice in energy sector with the common goal of contributing India's energy exploration and security. It is a non-profit scientific society, and it is a bridge between the connecting for the geophysicists, geologists, reservoir engineers, academicians, and energy industry professionals. And it was initiated 3 decades back, actually 33 years back in 1992, 15th August, and then it was registered in the next year in 1993. And it has now 10 regional chapters. Among that, one is overseas in the North America. And it has 15 student chapters. And total member is around 2,600, including life members, annual, and student membership. So vision of the SPG is to advance the science and practice of geophysics with a particular emphasis on application in the exploration and development of petroleum, natural gas, and other energy resources. And its main objective is to knowledge sharing, then professional development, academia collaboration, and promoting innovations. And for meeting the objective, what are the activities or initiative SPG of the different student chapter as well as other SPG chapters do? Those are the scientific talk like we are doing today one, and then conference and exhibition, then workshop and training program, and publication. One publication is Geo Horizon among that, and there are many newsletters also, and then outreach program, and then collaboration among the different institutions in India as well as outside. And in the SPG, also presently affiliated to various international societies such as ACG, Society of Exploration Geophysics USA, European Association of Geoscientists and Engineers, AGE, and the Netherlands Australian Society of Exploration Geophysics, Australia. And now coming to the Hyderabad chapter, it was formed in 2002, so it was also old now, 2 decades back, and now present member is 80. And I hope the new scientist or young scientist will be member this year, so we will make century in 2025 end. I request all young people to be SPG member. There are many benefits and we will get. Now we have long life to go, maybe 20 years, maybe 30 years or more. And also I want active participation of the young people for the SPG different activity. So if you have any idea what I saw, different activity, what SPG can do, then you can also contact any of us. Those are the present SPG chapter persons, right side I wrote, and then we can contribute together a meaningful something for the energy sector. For the different energy sector, it is not only petroleum, nowadays geothermal, and then other energy sources also we can do the thing. And I thank today's speaker for accepting our invitation in a very short notice. Around 1 week back, we talked with him, and he is coming Hyderabad actually. Tomorrow he has some program in IIT Hyderabad. So he agreed to talk, giving a talk here, and he will, it is very interesting topic. So I think all will be benefited. And one of the thing is collaboration in SPG activity you saw. So maybe we can do some collaboration with him, anybody, if anybody wants also. And thank you.
So before heading to the presentation, I like to invite Dr. Pratyut to introduce our guest speaker.
Good morning to President, Secretaries, Treasurer, and executive members of the SPG Hyderabad Chapter, scientists, technical staff, non-technical staff, and students. We are honored to have with us Dr. Achyut Mishra, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Earth Sciences at IIT Gandhinagar. Dr. Mishra holds an integrated BSc and MSc degree in applied geology from IIT Kharagpur. Then he earned his PhD from the University of Melbourne in Australia. His academic journey reflects a strong foundation in geosciences and a deep commitment to advancing subsurface modeling techniques. He has received several prestigious awards and honors, including the Institute Silver Medal at IIT Kharagpur and J.C. Ghosh Memorial Endowment Award, among others. Dr. Mishra's work lies at the intersection of sedimentary geology, reservoir characterization, and high-resolution geological modeling. He combines detailed sedimentological understanding with cutting-edge computational techniques such as numerical simulations, graph theory, and machine learning to tackle complexities of subsurface systems. His research is particularly focused on improving how we model and predict reservoir behavior in the presence of fine-scale heterogeneity, an area of vital importance to both academic and industrial applications. So today we look forward to an engaging and insightful session with Dr. Mishra. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Mishra onto the dais with a big round.
Thank you, Dr. Ray, and to Pratul for organizing this and having me here at a very, very short notice. I'm Achyut. I'm an assistant professor at IIT Gandhinagar. In today's presentation, I would be talking about the special scales in geology and how they might impact the flow of fluids and fluid rock reactions, especially focusing on fluids which are essential for energy transition and environmental sustainability. So before we go into the technical talk, I would briefly like to introduce you to my group and the kind of work we do. So this is my team. We have postdocs, PhD students, and master's students. And in terms of my research themes, we have three basic skill sets and capabilities. One on reservoir and geological modeling. So we go into the conventional way of building reservoir models, but also take high resolution techniques as well. And today's talk will focus a lot on this aspect. Then we go into multi-phase fluid flow. So once we have built the geological models, what do we do with that? So fluid flow is one of the applications that we try to address through these models. We do simulations all the way from pore scale to reservoir scale. So pore scale, core scale, outcrop scale. And so I'll present some of that work there. And then we also use these models for understanding fluid rock reactions. So for example, reaction kinetics, redox reactions and equilibrium conditions and all that, using techniques like reaction path modeling and reactive transport modeling. And so these three basic skill sets, they find application in areas where in areas such as geological carbon storage, carbon utilization in mine waste, critical mineral exploration, nuclear waste disposal, stimulated hydrogen production. So we are having some projects on each of these things. Some have, of course, are more advanced than the other ones. But this is the brief overview. So let's now go to the talk. So the main motivation behind today's presentation and my research work is mostly on utilizing the subsurface as a source of as a resource for energy transition and environmental sustainability. So as we all know, subsurface is a very nice repository of energy containing fluids like oil and gas, groundwater, geothermal, natural hydrogen, and it can also be used as a repository for disposing of the anthropogenic waste. And two of those wastes are nuclear wastes as well as the CO2 that is building up in the atmosphere. So what can we do with it? Can we put it down in the subsurface and use geology to sort of get rid of that? Now, the subsurface is very, very heterogeneous, and the heterogeneity depends on the scale that you are interested in. So more commonly, people would very much be familiar about the reservoir scale. So at reservoir scale, we can have heterogeneity in terms of depositional environment. So it could be a deltaic setting, it could be a tidal setting, and so on. So we could have heterogeneity in facies environments, in some structural features, so that so we can observe large scale folds and faults. Then if we go to the next spatial scale, the next smaller spatial scale, that's the outcrop scale, and the humans here are for scale. Here we see heterogeneity in terms of the stratigraphic layers, some structural features, again folds and faults. We get to see the geometry of different layers within these stratigraphic columns, and we can characterize that. If we go to the next smaller scale, which is the core scale, here we start seeing heterogeneity in terms of sedimentary features, some structural features like cracks at centimeter scale, and mineralogy. So that starts coming up at this scale, sort of. The next smaller scale is the pore scale, where we have a very, very tiny piece of rock, something at the size of your fingernail. We take that, we do holistic imaging of that rock and try to understand what the heterogeneity is in terms of pore geometry, pore connectivity, mineralogy, and other parameters. Now, these are not the only four spatial scales in geology. We can have scales which are larger than reservoir scales, for example, basin and tectonic scales. We have scales which are smaller than pore scales. But in the context of this talk, I'll sort of reserve my presentation to these four scales and how these are interlinked in the context of fluid flow. So the idea is to understand the impact of these heterogeneities on the fate of fluids that are there in the subsurface. So I'll first present some field observations. A very nice example is from the Sleipner CO2 storage site. This is a very well studied and very well experimented site located in North Sea. About 30 years back, it used to be an oil and gas field, but about 30 years back, people started to remodel it and redesign it for CO2 injection. So in this figure here, we have a platform through which CO2 is injected in this reservoir, and it's called the Utsira Formation. I'm not sure it's very well visible. It's basically a sandstone unit. It's got 9 layers of pretty homogeneous sandstone, and which are separated by the thin layers of low permeability rocks. So when the fluid is injected here, it tends to rise up vertically under buoyancy through these homogeneous sandstone layers until it hits that layer of low permeability and starts to spread underneath those layers. So we have over 30 years of seismic data for monitoring the plume movement, and the plume extent is sort of characterized or shown in this plot here over the years, so from 1999 to 2008. But we have more recent data as well from this site. So the general observation here that I want to point out is that the plume rises vertically within sandstone layers and spreads laterally underneath those low permeability layers. So this is more of a field observation. Now there is a very famous fluid flower experiment. I'm not sure if some of you are already aware of that. So what people from University of Bergen did, they built a sandbox, a 2D sandbox, roughly the size of this screen. And they had 2 layers of sands. One is in darker yellow shade, one is in the lighter yellow shade. The darker yellow shade has got higher porosity permeability, so fluids tend to move there. And the lower porosity permeability layer is in this light layer. So I'll try to play this video, which they sort of characterized. Injection of fluid flow from there. Let's hope it starts. Yes. So this is where the fluid was injected through this layer of high porosity and permeability. It rises vertically up until it hits this low permeability layer and spreads laterally underneath that layer. So this is the general fluid flow, and if you leave it for a long time, then that fluid would dissolve away and sink to the very bottom of the reservoir, and that's what we see also in our field scale observations. So these are 2 very famous cases of very simplistic geology. So there is nothing complicated in terms of geology. We have sandstone layers. We have a layer cake model, which we as geologists tend to understand very, very well. And the fluid flow, whether it's at an experimental lab scale or at the field scale, shows the same characteristics. So we sort of tend to conclude that we understand fluid flow, at least for these kind of geologies, very well. But then the problem was, when you start a project, you don't have the monitoring data, right? So Sleipner, I showed monitoring data from about over 30 years. But when the project was being started, people had to rely on simulation results. They still knew the geology very well because that was an oil and gas field. It's a depleted oil and gas field. So they knew what kind of sandstones are there, what their properties are. And they went ahead and started to do predictions based on numerical simulations. But then the problem, which was very well defined in this blog post, is it had the title, "Are we overconfident in predicting CO2 plume migration?" The idea there was, when the project was being started, these modeling and simulation results predicted that the CO2 would be moving at a rate of about 100 meters per year. And based on those, and there was sufficient confidence because there was a wealth of geological data that they had to come up to these numbers. But then, and based on that, they took some financial decisions like what should be the size of my acquisition area, what should be my injection rate, and things like that. But then, fast forward in time, in the year 2020, when the actual monitoring data came, the results suggested, and these are from the measurements, that the plume is migrating at about 300 meters per year. So the predictions were way off from reality. Now, there can be many reasons for that. Our computations are not good. Our geology or the data characterization is not good. But it's hard to believe for a site like Sleipner. We have wealth of geological data. We have like the top scientists and computational scientists working on these problems, so they understand the mathematics and all that. So what could be the problem? And it's important to identify it because these simulation results are like our first preliminary analysis of what would happen in future. So based on that, we tend to take a lot of decisions which also have financial implications. So it's very important to fix this gap between what we predict and what we tend to observe in reality. And one possible reason for that could be the underlying geology and geological heterogeneity. So for example, in Sleipner case, or even that lab scale fluid flower case, the geology is very simplistic. It's a layer cake model. But even for those models, if we look at the smaller scales, for example, the outcrop scale, there we can have a very, very complicated pattern of sedimentary structures. And in this study by Yusuf et al., they tried to simulate the flow of fluids in such heterogeneous rocks. Here, the black layers are the sedimentary laminations, which are low permeability layers. And we see that the migration of fluid is not just vertically up and then laterally spreading underneath some low permeability layer, but it's pretty complicated, and it sort of depends on what kind of geometry I have in terms of my geology. If we go to even smaller scale, at the core scale, in this study, the scientists, what they did, they had different sandboxes, the sedimentary patterns created in sandboxes, and used that for fluid injection simulations. The injection rate and parameters were all very similar, but the pattern of fluid spreading is very, very different. So again, that highlights that the sedimentary complexity is sort of to be taken into account in conventional reservoir models if we want to get a very, if we want to get closer to reality in terms of our predictions. And at the pore scale, this is a very a prime example of what would happen to reaction. So this is a core of basalt which comes from the Valula project. It's in the US, and there it was used. It's a site used for geological carbon storage. So what people did is they injected CO2 in this basalt formation and let it rest for 2 years. After 2 years, they had a borehole drilled and took out this piece of basalt to see what would happen to the geochemistry in a basalt which was essentially soaking in CO2 for 2 years. And we see that the basalt is there, but then the secondary minerals like calcite can be seen to be filling the pore spaces. Now the pattern of filling is very different. So for example, this pore is completely consumed, and we have a calcite grain very well formed in this pore. But if you look at pores like this, there is only a partial formation of calcite. Other pores like these ones, they do not see any secondary or any geochemical change. Now, one reason could be that these pores are not connected. But if they are connected, even then the fluid can be moving in very, very preferential flow paths, and only certain domain of the certain part of the domain can be subjected to my reactions or in the flow region. So the idea here is that these heterogeneities, they result in the existence of subseismic scale preferential fluid flow pathways, very evident from these examples. And these fluid flow pathways then lead to the preferential reaction spots. So everything changes. We do not have the entire domain undergoing the or seeing the influx of the fluid. So ultimately, it impacts the pressure buildup, migration velocity, trapping capacity, and all those estimates. So it's very important to bridge the gap between these smaller scales of heterogeneities and the larger reservoir scale heterogeneities. Now, how do we deal with this multi-scale heterogeneity problem? The classical approach, which is very widely used in oil and gas industry, is they focus on only two scales. One is the core scale, one is the reservoir scale. So they take some core samples from the boreholes that are drilled, and using some experiments, they come up with values of porosity and permeability. From those values, they tend to get a cross plot between porosity and permeability and some sort of correlation between them. And ultimately, this correlation then forms the basis of populating my porosity permeability values in the larger reservoir scale model. Now, so we get heterogeneity at the grid block scale, but the problem is that the grid blocks are about 10 meters by 10 meters by 2 meters. So roughly the size of this room maybe. So the problem here is for the size of this room where the geology can be extremely complicated, we have a core plug sample which is this size to inform the property value for the entire room. That's not correct at all, but this is a very widely followed practice and could be one of the reasons why we get predictions which are not close to reality. So in my work, I thought of fixing that and bridging this gap and overcoming this complete neglection of finer scale details, which then affect my preferential flow paths and reactions. So how do we bridge the gap? One way of doing is that we take a brute force approach. We do a detailed geological analysis and we take that high resolution data and put it all together in a reservoir model. And I'll talk about two case studies in this regard. One is by Howe et al. In 2019. They took a carbonate block of 1 meter height. They imaged it at 32 millimeter resolution, and then after imaging it, they did direct numerical simulations on that. The idea was that they inject an acidic fluid in a carbonate rock and see what the dissolution patterns and the formation of channels could look like. So this is what they got. There is one prominent flow channel where the acid dissolved the rock and formed the channel, but there are some other minor channels as well. Now this image has about 7,500 voxels. Just to put it in perspective, an average image that you click on your smartphone has about 20 lakh pixels. Now it's not a direct comparison because the phone image is a 2D image and this is a 3D image, but just to give you an idea. So this image is way lower in resolution compared to your phone image. Then they repeated the experiment with 1 millimeter resolution. So from 32 millimeters, they went to 1 millimeter resolution and redid the simulation exercise. And now they start to see very intricate patterns of dissolution of carbonate and formation of these channels. Very nice dendritic patterns. And the big major, so this major channel formation was roughly the same. But the main difference is in this secondary channel formation. So we do not have this channel very well formed in the low resolution domain, but very well formed in the high resolution domain. And this image had about 25 crore voxels. So just to give you an idea, just to drive the point that the resolution of your data set and the amount of geological realism that we put into these simulations can make massive difference in our predictions. But this comes at a cost. If you are dealing with domains which are such high resolution, we need really high computational facility. So this simulation was done on supercomputer with 4096 CPU cores. It's a very, very high-end computational facility. Now, the second example along these lines of taking the brute force approach was sort of attempted by Saudi Aramco. So they built a very detailed model of the Saudi Arabian basin, where the idea was that they wanted to put in a lot of geological realism in their modeling domain, and then simulated the presence and migration of oil and gas. So here the shades of red, they indicate where the oil might be present, and these white streaks are actually the streamlines where that motion of fluids is happening. And it's a very detailed model in the sense that it has about 1 lakh crore grid blocks. So very high detailed model. And this is one of its kind work done so far in this field. But again, the computational cost is so high, they did this simulation on their Sahin 2 supercomputer, which has about 1.5 lakh CPU cores. Now, so this brute force approach is really good. And their conclusion and what they made public was that a lot of inconsistencies that they were seeing in their conventional way of upscaling and building reservoir models, they all went away just by doing a high resolution model and appropriately building geology into their modeling domain. But then it comes at a cost. We can take this approach, but not all of us would have access to computational facilities like that. So what is a workable solution for this? An alternative solution which we can attempt. So here the idea is that we take an approach a nested approach where we sort of do a multi-scale step up of rock properties to capture the nature of lithological heterogeneity. So we have heterogeneity at pore scale, core scale, site scale, which is the maybe outcrop scale, and then the reservoir scale. So how do we bridge these heterogeneities together? And my numerical simulations are informed of all this. So that's where my work lies in sort of bridging this gap. So the starting point for these simulations is the pore scale. So we take our rock samples from the core plugs. We take 1 millimeter cube sample, which is very, very small, and use micro CT imaging to get the characterization of pore scale from these images. If you look at the scale, these are very small, hardly 1 millimeter in length. But we have done this exercise now for different kinds of rocks. We have sandstones, we have limestones, we have basalts, we have granites. So we have done this exercise for a lot of these samples. There are varying heterogeneities for all these kind of samples. The next step is, okay, once I get these pore scale domains, so by taking a core plug sample, choosing a very small area from that, putting it into a micro CT scanner, and doing some post-processing on those scanned images, we get this kind of domains. Then we bring it into a computational framework. So the first step there would be to build a mesh. And there are lots of different meshing techniques available. Adaptive meshing is one of the nicely used and implemented approaches, where we have larger grid blocks in certain parts of the domain and finer grid blocks on the other parts of the domain, depending on where the heterogeneity is detected. Then we put pressure difference across the domain. So the red end is the high pressure end, the blue end is the low pressure end. We solve the Navier-Stokes equation for the creeping flow solution and get the velocity field. From the velocity field, we can then calculate the pore average properties, which is relative permeability shown here, but we can do porosity, relative permeability, absolute permeability, capillary pressure, and all, maybe mineral composition, surface area of these minerals, and all those things can be calculated from this approach. So at this step, we have now taken our pore scale domain, understood what the pore scale geometry looks like, and what my properties would look like based on those heterogeneities. And these are some of the examples for those lithologies that I showed. So we have examples from sandstone. The first graph here is for the pressure difference. The second is showing the velocity field. So we see very detailed velocity fields in some of these samples, for example, in granites as well as for basalts. And in almost all of these samples, except for this one, because this is very, very homogeneous, we see preferential flow paths. So even in this sample here, we see that the flow is all mostly sort of centered around the center of the domain. And then we see for the basalt that the fluid is trying to move only towards this half of the domain, and the rest of the half is not covered. So we now are able to capture these preferential flow paths in these using this detailed approach. The next step is, once we have the pore scale data, we go to the next scale, which is the core scale. And again, the starting point there is we take the core samples, we put it through a scanner. This is a medical CT scanner in this example. We get the scan, and we can derive from that medical CT image the porosity distribution in the domain. And in the next step, we bring the data from this core scale measurement as well as the pore scale properties together and integrate them into a property map like a permeability map. Then we again take it to a simulation framework. So we would do meshing on that. We would apply pressure difference. We would solve Darcy equation at this scale. And ultimately, the results from the fluid flow simulations can then again be used to build my the properties averaged at the core scale. So now at this point, we have the information from core scale. We have pore scale information. We have put together in the form of these property maps. The relative permeability is shown here, but we can do it for other properties as well. The next step would be to go from core scale to reservoir scale. And in reservoir scale, we typically, the data sets that are available to us are structural map, we have seismic data, we have wireline log data, we have facies log. So this is what is conventionally used, but we want to now also use this pore to core scale upscale data that we have derived. So how do we bridge the gap between my core scale data as well as the conventional reservoir scale data? And for that, we have developed a new approach. The first step of this approach is to study only the homogeneous samples and try to deduce what lithologies they are. So there could be homogeneous sandstones, there could be homogeneous mudstone, carbonate cemented sandstone. And then we use this data set to identify the log signatures of these lithologies. We use 3 different logs: density, porosity, and gamma ray, and this is in the sedimentary reservoir context. So density log can be used to identify the presence of carbonate rock, porosity to identify the presence of sandstones, and gamma ray to identify the presence of mudstones and siltstones. So here you see some vertical lines which are sort of the threshold. So in terms of my carbonate cemented sandstone, I had only one lithology. So a high density value would mean that there is carbonate cement present, and a low value of this. So anything that lies below this line would mean that the carbonate cement is not present. Similarly, for the porosity, a high value would mean that we have coarse sandstone, a middle value would mean that we have homogeneous fine sandstone, and a low value would mean that we do not have sandstone at that depth. Similarly, for gamma ray, a high value would mean that we have mudstone, intermediate value would mean that we have siltstone, and a low value would mean that we do not have any clay-rich lithology. And then we go to each point in depth and try to interpret these signatures. So for example, if we go to this point in depth, we have density as very low and gamma ray as very low. So we do not have any carbonate cement, we do not have any clay-rich lithology, but the porosity signature is very high. So that indicates the presence of coarse sandstone. Similarly, for this point in depth, again, density and gamma ray are both low, but porosity is intermediate. So that indicates the presence of fine sandstone. So this way we can identify the location of these homogeneous lithologies along the depth direction. But then this approach can also be extended to heterogeneous samples like this one. So here the way we treat heterogeneous samples is a combination or a mixture of 2 homogeneous lithologies. So here the light gray lithology is a sandstone lithology, the dark gray lithology is a mudstone lithology. So if these 2 lithologies are existing together, we should see 2 signatures on the wireline log. So for example, at this point in depth, we have low density, meaning no carbonate, but we have intermediate porosity and intermediate gamma ray, meaning that fine sandstone and siltstone are existing together here. Similarly, for this depth, we have a high porosity and high gamma ray value, meaning that we have signatures for both coarse sandstone and mudstone existing together. So this way we can sort of identify the presence of these heterogeneous lithologies along the depth direction as well. So the essential idea is that we are now able to integrate the data from our core scale with the conventional reservoir scale data in terms of the lithological composition. And so this workflow was validated. So here we see some validation examples. So the first column shows what was predicted using this approach. And the last column here shows what the geologist saw. So the on-site geologist who was there at the site when the drilling was happening. So what was the notes from the geologist? So for example, for this interval in depth, where the core looks something like this, the algorithm predicted the presence of homogeneous carbonate cemented sandstone. And the geologist's comment was that the lithology at this depth reacts with 10% HCl. So there is a good corroboration between them. And another example I would say could be this one. So for example, here for these points in depth, we have lithologies looking like this. And the algorithm predicted these lithologies to be a composite of mudstone and coarse sandstone. And the geologist's note suggested that we have laminated medium sand with mud-sized grain. So again, a good corroboration. So it's a qualitative match, but still gives us a good idea whether what the algorithm is predicting can be believed or not. So now what we have is a log of rock types. So these are for different wells, but let's just focus on one well. So on the left-hand side, we have the facies log, which is the conventional reservoir modeling input data. On the right-hand side, we have the rock type log, which we have derived using this approach. And here the information on the pore scale property variations is built in. So all the measurements that we did from pore scale and core scale is sort of tied to this log. And in the conventional log, it has information about the reservoir scale variation. So the reservoir scale properties are sitting here. And so this is the way where we sort of bridge the gap between the two. And then what we can do is bring this new data set on rock type logs to our conventional reservoir modeling framework and get a rock type model where we have details of lithological variation. So different color codes are sort of indicative of different types of rocks. So the orange and red are for the homogeneous sandstone and carbonate cemented sandstone. So we see that the homogeneous rocks are very, very low in proportion in these kind of in this field to say, and all the shades of green and blue, they indicate composite rock types, which means mixed lithologies, which would otherwise not be picked up in the conventional reservoir modeling approaches. So a lot of green and blue. So here we have a lot more complicated geological patterns and sedimentary heterogeneity on that side. Then because we know we have measured the porosity and permeability for all these rock types, we can use these models to build a porosity model, a vertical permeability and a horizontal permeability model. So here we start to see in a very detailed sense, where are my high permeability zones, where are my low permeability zones. Of course, our conventional models also give that, but I'll show a comparison between the two. So this is the comparison in the geological models built using the conventional approach and the high resolution approach. Conventional meaning that we are using seismic, wireline and facies logs, the conventional way. And the high resolution approach, we use the 3 data sets, but we also bring the information on pore to core to reservoir scale upscaling. And if you compare these models for porosity and permeability, especially for permeability, you would see that in this model, the permeability in this zone is not very well characterized, but here we see that there is a very low permeability zone lying somewhere in between. Then this model also captures the presence of these very thin low permeability streaks, which will drive my fluid flow. But this model is not very sure of that. So there is some low permeability streak, but it's not too low. So the scales are the same on these maps, so you can compare the color codes as well. And similarly, the properties are also very different. So here we have relative permeability and capillary pressure for the conventional modeling approach, as well as for the high resolution modeling approach. So if you compare the figure for the first figure here and the first 2 figures there, which are for relative permeability, we see that we have in a conventional sense, we have very smooth looking relative permeability curves for the conventional model. But if you integrate all those geological heterogeneities and complicated sedimentary patterns, the curves are not looking as smooth. So there are way more complicated. So, and they would ultimately impact the nature of fluid flow and the preferential flow paths. So now we see the difference in the static geological models. Now let's go to the fluid flow simulations using essentially the same 2 reservoir models and injecting CO2 from this pot here, which is highlighted in white. So, and the idea was that if we inject CO2 here at 150 tons per day, a total of 10,000 tons injected. And we wanted to see how fast CO2 could travel between CRC3 well, which is my injection well, to CRC8 well, which is only 116 meters apart. This was the monitoring well. And if you look at these heat maps, you would see that the pattern of plume spreading is roughly in the conventional model that the plume goes up to a shallower depth and then it spreads through a high permeability layer. But in the high resolution model, we see a very preferential movement of fluid from CRC3 well to the CRC8 well. So here we see that the plume might not follow that conventional pattern of rising under buoyancy to shallower depths. It might be directed by these very fine high permeability streaks and very fine low permeability streaks. And the idea of this experiment was to blindly compare the real arrival time of the plume against that predicted by conventional high resolution resources. So this experiment was done on a site in Australia, close to Melbourne. And the result was that from the field observations, we see that the plume arrives from this point to this point in about 5 days of time. So very quickly, over 116-meter distance. Conventional model predicted that the arrival time would be somewhere close to 63 days. And the high resolution model predicted that it would be around 11 days. So we could not get a bang on match between the two, but we definitely got closer to reality by accounting for these detailed geological patterns into our models. And again, so if you, again, going back to the Sleipner case, if you go by these numbers, then it would also affect your financial decisions. For example, if you want to place some monitoring instruments in this well, and then you might think that, okay, I might want to rent my instruments after 2 months' time because the plume is not going to get there for 2 months. Why do I pay the rent for the extra 2 months? But then if you go to the high resolution model, then you might want to put the monitoring instrument within the first week of the after the injection as well. So it influences a lot of these financial decisions then. And as a base conclusion, the preferential fluid flow pathways were better captured in the high resolution model. And so we saw the difference made in the static geological models as well as the fluid flow fields. Now let's see the difference created in the fluid rock reactions. So again, we take the same domain, but then model using the conventional approach and the high resolution approach. We select a very small region from these two models for our reactive transport simulations to study the geochemical reactions. This comes from exactly the same facies, same location, and the only difference between the two approaches is their modeling background. So here in this approach, because the domain is not, the grid cells are the size of this room. So we have very few grid cells over this 100-meter by 6-meter domain. Only, I think 12 or 15 grid cells. But the color codes are for 2 sandstones. So yellow is one kind of sandstone, the orange is for other kind of sandstone. We don't have any composite or mixed lithologies built into this model. But the same model, when we look at from the high resolution approach, here we have about 12,000 grid cells. And we see, apart from yellow and orange, which are my sandstones, we also see shades of green and pink, which are sort of these clay-bearing lithologies, where these centimeter scale clay laminations are present. So once we take these two models and other data sets like mineralogy and fluid composition and put that into our reactive transport modeling framework, we see that the conventional model predicts that there will be absolutely no precipitation of any secondary minerals. But the high resolution model predicts that the secondary precipitation of dolomite would exist on these spots. And these spots are exactly the same spots where my clay-rich laminations were captured. So the accounting for these fine scale geological realism then again makes a lot of difference in terms of fluid rock reactions as well. And this is a natural analog example to sort of validate this observation from simulations. Here in this site, which comes from the Pretty Hill Formation again in Australia, the authors reported that the secondary minerals, they tend to form, like for example, in this case, it was calcite. They tend to form at the boundary of the mudstone sandstones. So at these very thin clay-rich laminations. So this is also a field observation as well. So that sort of gives us some confidence in the modeling approach. The major conclusion is that the holistic characterization and integration of core outcrop scale lithological heterogeneity in conventional reservoir models can help us improve predictions of fluid flow and fluid rock reactions and get closer to reality. Then application areas, geological CO2 storage is one of the areas where I've been working on. So taking this approach can help us get more realistic estimates of a reservoir's CO2 trapping potential. And so the estimates on plume spreading, pressure buildup, and associated risks can also be characterized and sort of quantified in a much better way. CO2 EOR applications where we can get improved estimates of tertiary oil recovery. For example, studying the impact of these small capillary heterogeneities on viscous fingering. Mineral exploration, we can use these approaches to build genetic models of ore mineralization and integrate it with fluid flow and fluid rock geochemistry to get an improved estimation of where my mineralization hotspots could be there in the subsurface. The stimulated hydrogen production, we want to see what the fluid rock reactions with the ultramafic rocks would look like with water. So sort of inducing serpentinization manually in these rocks to get an estimate of what the hydrogen production capacity of these peridotites could look like. Nuclear waste disposal, we want, if we go for these detailed analysis, we can get information on what is the estimate, what is the risk of contaminant leakage over 10,000 years time scale from these domains. And specifically for geothermal studies, because a lot of you might be interested in that. So I put a few slides on that, especially on the Tattapani case. So this is what I gathered from literature. Here we see some geological information on the Tattapani site. And this is a paper from 1987. We have, in terms of geology, the Proterozoic basement shown here, the Gondwana sediments, and then there are some faults in the area. So it's a very a nice study in terms of its geology and lithological composition. We have crystalline rocks, we have sandstones, we have shales, we have faults. So 4 different key types of petrophysical domains, I would say, are present. So the fluid migration, maybe the major fluid migration is happening through faults, but then the presence of these sandstone layers could also drive some of that fluid flow and the associated reactions. And my Proterozoic or the crystalline basement might have some microfractures through which there could be some small scale fluid flow, and ultimately it would affect the chemistry of those rocks as well. So I took this data set and very quickly put together a conceptual model. This is nowhere close to reality, but just to give you a context that we have a Gondwana sediment domain, we have a Proterozoic domain, we have a set of faults, and one of these faults is separating the sandstone layers from the crystalline basement. So this kind of geological information can then help us inform in some way of how we can put it together on a 3D modeling framework. Of course, this will get enriched if we have geophysical data as well and a more detailed characterized sedimentological or petrophysical properties. In terms of petrophysical properties, we tend to use for the Proterozoic, sandstone and shale layer, and as well as for the fault layer, parameters like porosity and permeability, which is just the simulation of water. If it's two-phase simulation, like for example, some sort of oil is leaking into the domain or some gas is being produced, and we also add relative permeability and capillary pressure measurements there. Then geophysical data set, for example, the isotherm maps here shown from this paper. We have fluid composition data which would go into these simulations. So the concentration of different ions in different bore wells. We can have mineralogical data sets. For example, what is the mineral makeup? So these are just made up numbers, just so to say, but to give you an idea of different minerals and what their proportions could be, would go into these modeling framework. And ultimately some reaction kinetic parameters like my surface area for different minerals, activation energy, rate constant, and parameters like this. So if we have a holistic measurement of parameters like fluid composition, then my mineralogy, surface area, porosity and permeability, as well as some geophysical data, all of that can then go into integrated with my geological model, put it into a reactive transport modeling framework, and we can assess some of these properties that we can get out from there is what my fluid flow nature is going to look like, what my mineral composition change is going to look like, how is the fluid chemistry and pH and other parameters are going to evolve, what is the impact of these chemical changes on petrophysical properties, and some uncertainty analysis. For example, if you want to put a production well, how much of water are you going to produce out? So if we have a very high production rate, how that would help or influence the motion of fluids and the reactions, as well as if you have multiple production wells with small production rates, how would that affect the rate? So And also parameters like, so for example, if we draw a lot of water, what are we going to do with? Are we going to re-inject it back into the formation? So where should we place our injection well? What should be our injection rate, and what would be the associated pore pressure buildup? So the risks on the tectonic stability of the region and all those things then can be determined using that. Some of the questions of interest could be that we can get an understanding of the local and regional fluid flow, not only the petrophysical properties of the fault, but also of the crystalline and sedimentary rocks. It can help us in identifying sweet spots for production well placement. Then we can have we can assess changes to pore fluid during water production and injection, can help us identifying in maximum production and injection rates for ensuring the tectonic stability of the region. We don't induce seismicity by these operations. Quantifying the rate of secondary mineral precipitation, it can help us in deducing the rate at which the pores, the fault aperture, and the well interior would get clogged by the precipitation of these, especially the silica precipitation. And so it would impact the production rates over very long periods of time. And can we come up with some engineered geochemical solutions to suppress silica scaling? And in countries like Iceland and New Zealand, they already implement these kind of techniques where some sort of chemicals are put in to remove those silica scales and preserve my pore structure so that the plant life is enhanced. And that's all from my end. So thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to take any questions now. Right, so yeah. We can do that. So the data set that I had was up till that, so that was a limitation, but ultimately we can go to deeper depths as well. So that's not a problem. In terms of what? Yes, so we can do that. So for example, in these simulations, we can run the simulations for, let's say, 100 years or 1000 years and see what my decline in production rate would look like, what my precipitation of secondary minerals would look like. So combining all these things, we can get estimates on that. Different techniques. So heterogeneity over scales quantification. So heterogeneity would be in terms of different properties. So for example, if I want to see heterogeneity in porosity, then there are different techniques to measure porosity at pore scale, core scale, and reservoir scale. So for reservoir scale, we would have it from wireline logs. For core scale, we would have some, or let's say permeability. We would have it from core flooding experiments, and then from pore scale, it's mostly coming from numerical simulations. Yes, so if I go back, the characterizations, for example, if you don't have pore scale data, you can still, so the idea of this exercise was to pick up points in depth where two lithologies will coexist, right? So for example, lithologies like this, which are very, very fine in their thickness. And because I had pore scale investigations done, so I would know the permeability for this lithology as well as for this lithology. So that's where I would combine those two together so that I would know that at the core scale, this is my overall permeability looking like, right? And then in the using these logs, I would identify where is this kind of lithology going to exist. So I would get a log of permeability, which is sensitive to these fine scale laminations, and the properties are from there. So, so for the logs, I don't have the figure right now, but I'll show. For the, if you just see it on the log scale, look at this figure. So this is at the log scale, where we have some very simple core data present there. So these kind of correlations are only valid if you have a homogeneous sample. If you have those lithologies, which are very, very complicated in sedimentary structure, these correlations don't work at all. So for that purpose, getting data directly from your logs is not recommended. So that's where you need to have these upscaling approach from pore to core scale built in. In my model, so I would take a domain from here, this lithology and this lithology. I'll get permeabilities for both of them using my pore scale simulations. For this, for 1 centimeter scale, you can't get it from logs. You can see it, but how would you convert it into permeability? That's the question. You can see the sedimentary patterns all there, so it's on a core log you will see. But if you look at, compare that with a wildline log of, let's say, porosity or permeability, those patterns don't reflect very well for the heterogeneous lithologies. And I can show you some of the results I have in other images. So the idea there is that for heterogeneous core lithologies, you will still see the sedimentary patterns, but the permeability that you are getting measured from these wildline tools is not very sensitive to the presence of the centimeter scale resolution. And the reason is that the wildline logs have a resolution limitation of 5 centimeters, the very best ones, typically 15 centimeters. So anything which lies below that scale, you will get a value on the log, but then that's not sensitive to my centimeter scale laminations. Yeah. So bigger picture is, so once we get the say the rock type logs, after this exercise, we get a rock type log like this, right? So this rock type log is actually carrying the information where my complicated sedimentary features are lying, what their porosity and permeability is. So we get a depth-wise record. So the properties are included in these lithologies. So from my pore scale and core scale simulations, I know what the porosity and permeability range for this lithology is there. And from this log, I know where this lithology is lying. So that is like getting a corrected version of my porosity and permeability using this approach and not relying solely on the wildline log measurements. Yes, it can.
Can also use some
I have not specifically looked into that, but there is a paper by a group in Edith Cowan University in Australia. Very recently, I think last year, they published that. So the impact of CO2 injection and the temperature difference between the reservoir and the plume, and how the thermal stresses would act on that. So I'm not the right person to go into the details of that, but you can look at that paper.
Sorry, I have to announce again because mic was off. Anyone who's watching online, if you have any questions, please type in the comments. Helen?
Again, so for example, if I can rephrase your question. So on this log, we have core samples from some depth. Is that what? Yeah, and then how do we put into the 3D framework? So 3D framework, we use the traditional way of, as we do it in reservoir modeling, so kriging based interpolations. And so that is one way of doing it. The other way is object based modeling and taking. So that way, but the property correction is there. So we are not again relying on the wildline log measured values because they don't work really well for the heterogeneous samples. And the result is here in this slide where you can compare. Both of them have the same interpolation and technique, but then the property maps look very, very different. Using the simulation results. At the static modeling, we can't really say because we do not really know what lies in between. So here this model is predicting a low permeability zone existing in between, but we get field data like this one. So the arrival time and when the plume will come, and we do our simulations. So that way we can get some estimate of whether we are closer to reality or not. For calculating the velocity streamlines, which is my primary output there, I use a high pressure end. So open flow boundary conditions on the two sides, and the other sides are closed. So there is no transfer of mass in. So we simply apply a pressure differential between the two. So the fluid is free to come in from one boundary and leave from the other boundary. Logic. So let's say in one of my post scale simulations, I took a pressure difference of 10 pascals. Then we do some sort of and to measure permeability. So if you change the pressure difference, your velocity field will change, but the permeability value still comes out to be the same. So the choice of those numbers, the pressure difference, is not really for permeability. It's not very relevant. As long as you are not going out of the Darcy flow regime and going into turbulent flow regimes, we can have any combination of pressure difference and still get the same permeability because that's a rock property.
Excellent presentation, very nice. One question I have, when you are bringing your core model into the log model, you are upscaling your model to the rock log. And then again, you are upscaling when you are bringing it along with the size. What is the minimum resolution of your rock model log that can be seen on seismic? Because seismic has got its own resolution limitation.
Yeah.
So it is 2 milliseconds. If you see in time domain, when you convert depending on depth, velocity, and other, it changes. So what will be your resolution at the reservoir model level?
So, seismic data that we had in this case, in terms of depth, it was 7.5 meters by 7.5 meters resolution horizontally, and vertically, I think 3 meters, if I don't really recall it, but 7.5 by 7.5 there. And my from pore scales, I start from centimeter scale, 1 centimeter and all, and below that we have pore scale. So in terms of upscaling, we do not jump directly from say 1 centimeter to 7.5 meter scale. The seismic data we use only to get an idea of where my facies environments are. So for example, if I go back a little bit, I use my seismic data only for getting the estimate of where my large scale geological bodies are located. And that's where I stop using that. And then from my centimeter scale models, I bring it systematically upscale to just 30 centimeter resolution. So this vertical resolution is only 30 centimeters. So from, let's say, so in 30 centimeters, we'll have some combination of these laminations. And it's easy to identify whether my upscaling approach is mathematically making sense or not. Otherwise, if you go directly from this resolution to 7.5 meter resolution, that means you are clubbing together a lot of different complicated sedimentary features. So we avoid that.
That was my question.
Yeah.
So when you upscale from say your core model to the reservoir model, you are already averaging out the
No. So in this exercise, we don't. So we stop at this resolution, and here we have made some upscaling from, let's say, 2 or 3 centimeters to 30 centimeters. But at that scale, we do not lose as much information to the mathematics. But if you go to, let's say, 2 or 3 or 5 meter resolution, then there is a big loss of information.
How you fit it into seismic?
Don't fit. So the seismic is only there to get the environments.
I think in rock type model, you are taking the guidance of seismic.
So these geo bodies, the large scale geobodies, for example, this yellow one is my distributary channel. So this distributary channel has a particular composition or proportion of these different rock types. For example, it will have more of homogeneous core sandstone, and which is what we see here. So this geometry is used to inform or take into account the proportion of different rock types. So that's where it's bridged.
Fine, thank you.
Dr. Archit, it was indeed a great talk. I was just thinking, you have seen the consequence of CO2 injection as calcite. So no other expression have you seen in your pores, or are there any other consequences by injecting CO2?
In terms of mineralogy?
Yeah, mineralogy or
Mineralogy, calcite is one of the carbonate phases. Typically, we see more of anchorite and dolomite in some of these cases.
okay.
And otherwise, so sometimes the expression is in terms of the clogging up of pore spaces, but that's not very widespread. Then we might have some salting out effect. So close to the injection well, when CO2 is injected, at least in supercritical state, because there is a lot of CO2 in very less water, so that water tends to evaporate, and as it evaporates, it clogs the pore space around the well, and there is a lot of salt around that. So those kind of expressions are there.
I mean, in terms of like it is already heterogeneity is there, a lot of, and in terms of stability, do injection of CO2, are you going to estimate, or will it affect on your measurements or not? First thing that
Stability in terms of the
the rock stability of
Yeah.
ground.
So typically in CO2 storage operations, when we inject, we make sure that the change in pore or the rise in pore pressure is less than half of the lithological stress, so that we do not go into the realm of geomechanics and the possibilities of fracturing the rock. So that way that there is an upper limit to it. We don't want to get into those realms, because if we trigger some sort of geomechanical changes, then there is always a risk of induced seismicity, and the projects may not get approval.
And is it a CO2 plume? You are coining as like CO2 plume. So you are injecting. I mean, can be just like a query. Is it a plume, CO2 plume, or it is just a?
At the injection rates of plume, by plume I mean to say its geometry when it rises within the formation. At the injection stage, there can be two strategies. One is that you dissolve CO2 in water, something like Coca-Cola, and then put it in the subsurface. So that is all water phase and aqueous phase. The other strategy is that you take gaseous CO2, compress it to a supercritical stage, and then put it in the subsurface. So those two strategies are there. Typically, the rise in pore pressure and the stability of the rock is more at risk if you use the supercritical stage. And if you take the water soluble sort of option, then the rise in pore pressure is not that much.
Thank you.
At the beginning? The idea is that even for these simple structures, it's not very well, built into these lab scale models. But in real field scale models, if you have a homogeneous sandstone, it still can have some sort of sedimentary heterogeneity in there. And the idea is that the reality looks something like this, but the modeling and simulation neglects that. This is from outcrop. So if we go and study outcrops and see what kind of sedimentary patterns are there, what is their geometry in terms of the lamina thickness, and how they are distributed at the outcrop scale. So from outcrops, so outcrop would typically be 1 or 2 meters, and there we can identify the presence of these sedimentary structures. So that is one way of knowing that. It is very difficult, but ultimately, if you want to make your models better, then that is the way. That is It's not, in recent times, not a very manual exercise. So people now use drones for imaging these outcrops. And from those images, we can extract out these sedimentary features. So that automatic thing is also there now. Yeah. That is why. If you're doing any lab measurements, the idea is that you do it at a REV scale. REV is representative elementary volume. So for example, if core. So if you have a core and a homogeneous part of the core, then you might need very small volume of that to say that it's at a REV scale and do all your measurements on that scale. So if you do all these measurements, that property can directly be translated from the smaller scale to the larger scale. And if it's a heterogeneous sample with, let's say, too many sedimentary laminations, the ideal state would be that we take measurements for each of those laminations. Do the REV analysis first before sort of doing the experimental work or running numerical simulations, just to be sure that the properties that we are measuring can be translated into the next larger scale or not. Yes. And for complicated geologies, it's a lot of samples and a lot of analysis. So for example, in one of my works that my student is doing, she is looking at basalts, the heterogeneity in basalts, and she had to run about 53,000 simulations to get an estimate of what the representative elementary volume of those basalts would look like. And so, we have a framework of all these modeling and simulation work, but then after doing that exercise, we now know how big my basalt sample should be, or either for the lab scale experiment or for numerical simulations. And whatever porosity, permeability properties we would get from that size sample, we can then confidently use it for the next scale.
So if there is no more question, let's appreciate given by Dr. There is no question online as well.
Thank you all for coming in.
On behalf of SPG Chapter, as expression of gratitude, we would like to present a memento to you. I request Dr. Pani Madam, please. Thank you, ma'am. Now, at the end, I thank you once again. Now, as a formal vote of thanks, I invite Dr. Ganguly to proceed.
Dear all, thank you so much for being here. And we appreciate Dr. Achyut to come here and give a talk, and it was quite engaging, we saw. Thank you so much, Dr. Achyut from IIT Gandhinagar for delivering this special lecture for this SPG and CSIR both hosted. So thank you so much for that. And we also thank our SPG President, Dr. Lavanya, Vice President, and all the members, EC members, and all the members of SPG for helping to make this event too, and also the members who came here to see this talk and through online and offline as well. Thank you so much for attending this talk. And we all would like to thank the members who have helped to make this event successful, arranging everything. So thank you so much. And all the viewers came here and online. Thank you so much. Yeah, with this, I would like to thank you once again. Thank you so much.